Look what you've done. Pick those up and get back to selling them before I deal with you.
Maltreated by her wicked uncle and forced to drop out of school to sell groundnuts, a resilient orphan girl remains loyal to a humble suitor, unaware that he is actually a billionaire prince in disguise testing her love. Hope's heart beat as fast as a drum. Today was the day of the big quiz at school. She had studied for weeks, reading her textbooks by the faint light of a kerosene lamp, long after everyone else in the small house was asleep. If she did well, she might have a chance at the scholarship. A scholarship was her only ticket out of a life of endless chores and her aunt's sharp words. "Grace, are you ready?" she called to her stepsister, her voice filled with excitement. She smoothed down her clean but faded school uniform. The shirt was a little tight at the shoulders, and the skirt was a little short, but it was the best she had. Grace appeared from their shared room, her own uniform crisp and new. "I'm ready, Hope, but we must hurry. You know Mama Rose doesn't like us to be late." Hope grabbed her worn school bag, which held a single exercise book and a sharpened pencil. That was all she owned for her education. She followed Grace to the front of the house, her steps light with anticipation. Their aunt, Auntie Rose, was standing on the porch. Her arms were crossed over her large chest, and her face was set in a deep frown. Behind her, leaning against a pillar, was Joy, Auntie Rose's daughter. Joy had a smug look on her face, a look that always meant trouble for Hope. "And where do you think you are going?" Auntie Rose's voice was as sharp as broken glass. Hope's cheerful mood vanished like smoke. "Good morning, Auntie. We are going to school. Today is the quiz." Auntie Rose let out a short, harsh laugh. "Quiz? Did you forget what I told you last night? You are going to the farm. The weeds are choking my cassava plants." Hope's heart sank. "But Auntie, I promised the teacher I would be there. It's very important. I can go to the farm as soon as I get back from school. I promise I will finish all the work." "You will do no such thing," Auntie Rose snapped. "The farm comes first. Your sister Joy needs food to eat so she can study and become somebody important. Your education can wait." Joy giggled, a cruel sound that stung Hope more than her mother's words. "Yes, Mama. The weeds are very tall. Someone has to do the dirty work." Grace stepped forward, her expression worried. "Mama, please. It's just for a few hours. The quiz is very important for Hope." "You be quiet," Uncle Ben shouted, appearing from inside the house. He was a large man with a permanent scowl. "Go to school with your sister. Hope knows her duty." Hope looked from her uncle's angry face to her aunt's cold one. There was no kindness there, no understanding. They saw her not as a niece, but as a servant. It had been this way ever since her parents had died in a car accident 5 years ago. She and her younger brother had been sent to live with their uncle, her father's younger brother. But this was not a home. It was a prison of hard work and harsh words. Tears welled up in Hope's eyes, but she blinked them back. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "Please, Auntie," she whispered one last time, her voice trembling. "Go and drop that bag and get the hoe," Auntie Rose commanded, turning her back. "And you two," she said to Grace and Joy. "Get to school before you are late." Grace looked at Hope with sad, helpless eyes before Joy pulled her by the arm. "Let's go, Grace. We don't want to be late because of a house girl." Hope stood frozen on the dusty ground as her two stepsisters walked down the path, their laughter floating back to her. The bright morning suddenly felt grey and cold. The promise of the quiz, the tiny spark of hope for a different future, was gone. All that was left was the heavy weight of the hoe and the long, lonely path to the farm. She slowly turned and walked back into the house. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. She passed the small, framed picture of her parents that sat on a dusty shelf. Their smiling faces seemed to look at her with sympathy. "Be strong, my child," she imagined her mother saying. "Your spirit is bigger than this house." Taking a deep breath, Hope went to the back of the house where the farm tools were kept. She picked up the heaviest hoe, its wooden handle smooth and worn from use. It felt heavier than usual today, as if it carried all her broken dreams. With a heavy heart, she stepped out of the house and began the long walk to the cassava farm, leaving her school bag behind on her small bed. The path was dry and red, and the sun was already beginning to beat down with the fierce heat of the Nigerian morning. Each step felt like a step away from her future, but even as she walked, a small, stubborn thought took root in her mind. They could stop her from going to school today, but they could not stop her from dreaming. She would do the work. She would do it faster and better than ever before. and tomorrow she would find a way to get back to her books. She had to. It was the only promise she could make to herself. The sun climbed higher in the sky, a hot, white circle that seemed to press down on Hope's back. The cassava farm stretched out before her, a sea of green leaves and thick, stubborn weeds. The earth was hard and dry, marked with cracks like old scars. Hope swung hoe, the metal blade biting into the ground with a dull thud. Thud, thud, thud. It was a rhythm of hard labor, a song of sweat and sorrow. With each weed she pulled, a memory of her parents surfaced. She remembered her father, a kind man with a deep laugh, who used to tell her stories under the mango tree in their old compound. He always told her, "Hope, your mind is a garden. Plant good seeds of knowledge, and you will harvest a beautiful future." Her mother, with her gentle hands and warm smile, would braid her hair and whisper, "Education is your light. Never let anyone put it out." Now, their voices felt like distant echoes. The only reality was the burning sun, the ache in her shoulders, and the endless rows of cassava plants. Auntie Rose and Uncle Ben never spoke of her parents. It was as if they had never existed. But for Hope, they were everywhere. In the rustle of the leaves, in the warmth of the sun, in the very beat of her own heart. She worked without stopping, her mind focused on one thing: finishing. If she could clear this section of the farm, maybe Auntie Rose would have no excuse to keep her home tomorrow. The thought gave her a small burst of energy. She worked faster, her hoe a blur of motion, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Around midday, she heard a soft voice call her name. "Hope?" She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. It was Grace, holding a small plastic bottle of water. She must have come during her school break. "I brought you some water," Grace said, her voice full of pity. "You must be so tired." Hope dropped her hoe and gratefully took the bottle. The water was warm, but it was the kindest thing that had happened all day. She drank it slowly, feeling the liquid soothe her dry throat. "How was the quiz?" Hope asked, trying to keep the sadness out of her voice. Grace looked down at her polished school shoes, now covered in a fine layer of red dust. "It was difficult. Everyone missed you. The teacher asked where you were." Hope felt a fresh pang of disappointment. "What did you tell her?" I said you were not feeling well," Grace mumbled. "I'm sorry, Hope. I tried to speak to Mama again, but she and Papa, they are very angry today." Hope nodded, understanding the fear in her stepsister's eyes. Grace was not cruel like Joy or Auntie Rose, but she was timid. She was too scared to stand up to their parents. Hope couldn't blame her. She had seen what happened when anyone disobeyed Uncle Ben. His anger was like a storm, and it was safer to stay out of its path. "It's okay, Grace," Hope said, handing the empty bottle back to her. "Thank you for the water. I wish I could help you," Grace whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "It's not fair. You are cleverer than all of us. You should be in school." "I will be," Hope said, her voice surprisingly firm. She picked up her hoe again. The handle felt a little lighter now. "I will finish this work today, and tomorrow I will go to school." Grace looked at her, a mixture of admiration and worry on her face. "Be careful, Hope. Mama is in a very bad mood." She hesitated for a moment, then turned and hurried back down the path, a small figure in a clean uniform returning to a world that Hope could only dream of. Left alone again, Hope looked at the vast, unfinished portion of the farm. It seemed impossible, but Grace's visit had done more than just quench her thirst. It had reminded her that she was not entirely alone. Someone saw her struggle. Someone believed in her. She thought of her father's words again. A beautiful future. It seemed so far away, almost like a fairy tale. But as she raised the hoe and brought it down on another stubborn weed, she felt a flicker of defiance. The weeds were like her aunt's cruelty, trying to choke the life out of her dreams. But the cassava plants were like her hope, still growing, still reaching for the sun. And she would not let them be overcome. She would clear the path for them, one painful swing at a time. The scars on the earth were deep, but her will was deeper. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple by the time Hope finished the last row of the cassava farm. Every muscle in her body ached, and her hands were raw and blistered. She walked home slowly, the heavy hoe feeling like an anchor on her shoulder. The usual evening sounds of the village, children laughing, goats bleating, the distant hum of a generator, seemed to mock her exhaustion. As she approached the house, She heard voices from the front porch. It was Auntie Rose and Uncle Ben, their chairs creaking as they sat in the cooling air. She tried to slip past them to the back of the house, but her uncle's voice stopped her. "So, the princess has returned from her royal duties," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Hope kept her eyes on the ground. "Good evening, Uncle." "Good evening, Auntie." "Did you finish the work?" Auntie Rose asked, not even bothering to look at her. "Yes, Auntie, I've finished everything." "Good," Uncle Ben grunted. "Now go and prepare dinner. Your sisters are hungry from studying all day." Without another word, Hope went to the small, dark kitchen at the back of the house. There was no gratitude, no word of praise for the back-breaking work she had done. It was as she expected. She was just a pair of hands, a tool to be used and then put away. As she started to peel yams for dinner, she could still hear their voices drifting from the porch. They were talking about money, about the high cost of Joy's new textbooks, and the fees for her extra lessons. "That girl must become a doctor or a lawyer," Auntie Rose was saying. "We are not wasting our money for nothing, unlike some people who think school is a playground." The words were a direct jab at Hope. She felt a familiar knot of anger and sadness tighten in her stomach. She finished preparing the meal in silence, her mind a whirlwind of frustrated thoughts. She served them their dinner, then took her own small portion to the back step, eating alone in the growing darkness. Later that night, long after the house had fallen silent, Hope lay on her thin mat, staring up at the ceiling. The ache in her body was a dull, constant throb, but the ache in her heart was sharper. She thought about the scholarship Grace had mentioned. It was a faint light in a very dark tunnel, but how could she even apply if she couldn't attend school? She closed her eyes and saw her mother's face, her smile full of encouragement. "Education is your light." The words echoed in her mind. She couldn't let them put it out. She just couldn't. Suddenly, an image flashed in her mind. The edge of the cassava farm, where a patch of groundnut plants grew wild. Her uncle never bothered with them, calling them useless weeds. But Hope knew better. Her mother used to roast groundnuts and sell them in small paper cones at the market. She remembered the rich, nutty smell that would fill their small house, the warmth of the fire, the jingle of coins in her mother's purse. An idea, small and fragile at first, began to grow in her mind. What if she could do the same? She sat up, her heart starting to beat a little faster. She could wake up early, before anyone else. She could go to the farm, harvest the groundnuts, and roast them. She could sell them at the village junction on her way to the farm, or even at the market in the evenings. It wouldn't be much money, but it would be her own. Coin by coin, she could save up for her school fees. She could buy her own books, her own uniform. She could pay her own way. The thought was both terrifying and thrilling. Terrifying because she knew what would happen if Auntie Rose found out. She would take the money, just as she took everything else. But it was also thrilling because it was a plan. It was a secret. It was a path that she could carve for herself, away from the control of her aunt and uncle. A small smile touched Hope's lips for the first time that day. The scent of roasted groundnuts, a memory from her happy past, suddenly smelled like the future. It smelled like hope. She lay back down, the aches in her body forgotten. Her mind was now busy with calculations. How many groundnuts could she harvest in one morning? How much could she sell them for? How long would it take to save enough for one term's fees? The questions were many, but for the first time in a long time, they were questions about her own life, her own choices. Sleep finally came, and for the first time in a long while, her dreams were not of sadness, but of the rich, promising scent of roasted groundnuts. The first hint of grey light was just beginning to appear in the sky when Hope slipped out of the house. The air was cool and damp, and the village was still asleep. She moved silently, her bare feet making no sound on the dusty path leading to the farm. Her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and excitement. This was her secret mission, the beginning of her fight for her future. She reached the patch of groundnut plants at the edge of the farm and quickly got to work. She carefully pulled the plants from the soil, shaking the dirt from the clusters of nuts. She worked with a sense of urgency, her eyes constantly darting back towards the path, afraid that someone might see her. She filled her small sack until it was heavy, then hurried back to the house. Behind the kitchen, in a small hidden corner, she built a tiny fire with dry twigs. She washed the groundnuts and placed them in an old blackened pan. As the nuts began to roast, a familiar, delicious aroma filled the air, carrying her back to her childhood. It was the scent of her mother's love, of a time when her life was filled with warmth and safety. For a moment, she closed her eyes and allowed the memory to wash over her, strengthening her resolve. When the ground nuts were perfectly roasted, golden brown and fragrant, she let them cool and then packed them into small paper cones she had made from an old newspaper. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the cones on a small, battered tray. This was it. She had to time it perfectly. She did her morning chores in a rush, fetching water from the well and sweeping the compound. As soon as Auntie Rose and Uncle Ben were busy with their own morning routines, Hope picked up her tray and her hoe. She told them she was going to the farm to check on the yams, a plausible excuse that they accepted with a dismissive wave. She walked towards the village junction, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. What if no one bought them? What if people laughed at her? She took a deep breath and reminded herself of why she was doing this. This was for her education. This was for her future. At the junction, a few people were already gathered, waiting for the first Danfo bus of the day. Hope stood nervously to the side, her voice barely a whisper as she called out, "Ground nuts for sale, freshly roasted ground nuts." At first, no one seemed to notice her. A group of men were arguing loudly about politics and some women were gossiping. Hope felt her courage begin to fade. Maybe this was a foolish idea. Just as she was about to give up, a kind-faced woman with a baby strapped to her back walked over to her. "How much for one cone, my dear?" she asked with a warm smile. 50 naira, ma," Hope replied, her voice trembling slightly. "They smell delicious," the woman said, handing her a crumpled 50 naira note. "Give me 2. Hope's hands shook as she took the money and gave the woman 2 cones of groundnuts. It was her first sale. The 50 naira note felt warm and powerful in her hand. It was more than just money. It was proof that she could do this. As the morning wore on, more people stopped to buy her groundnuts. A bus driver bought 5 cones for his passengers. A group of school children pooled their pocket money to share one. By the time the sun was high in the sky, her tray was empty. She counted the small collection of notes and coins. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was a start. It was a seed of independence she had planted herself. She carefully tied the money in a knot at the corner of her wrapper and picked up her hoe. She still had a long day of work ahead of her on the farm, but her steps were lighter now. The weight of the hoe no longer felt so heavy. Day after day, Hope continued her secret business. She would wake before dawn, roast her groundnuts, sell them at the junction, and then spend the rest of the day toiling on the farm. She kept her small earnings hidden in a little clay pot buried under a loose floorboard in her room. Each evening she would add the day's profit to her secret stash, a quiet ritual that filled her with a sense of purpose. One afternoon, as she was packing up her tray at the market, a young man who had become her most regular customer approached her. He worked at the nearby construction site, and his face and clothes were usually smudged with cement dust, but his eyes were always kind. "You're sold out again today, groundnut girl," he said with a friendly smile. His name was David. Hope smiled back. "Yes, thank God." "You work very hard," he said, his gaze serious. "Every day I see you here, and I hear you also work on your family's farm." Hope felt a blush creep up her neck. No one had ever acknowledged her hard work before. "I have to," she said softly. "I understand," David said, nodding. "I also work hard. We all have to make a better life." There was something about the way he spoke, a quiet strength and understanding that made Hope feel comfortable. He wasn't like the other young men in the village who made crude jokes or stared at her. He saw her, the real her. "I am saving up," Hope found herself admitting, surprised by her own boldness. "For my school fees." David's smile widened, revealing a set of strong white teeth. "That is a wonderful thing. Education is very important." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the bustling market a noisy backdrop to their quiet connection. For the first time, Hope felt like she had a friend, someone who understood her dreams without judging them. As she walked home that evening, she clutched her small earnings tightly. The money was a promise of school, but the memory of David's kind eyes was a different kind of promise. Promise of friendship, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of happiness in her harsh world. The Harmattan season had begun to settle over the village, bringing a cool, dusty haze that softened the edges of the sun. Hope's groundnut business was doing well. Her secret stash of money in the clay pot was growing. And with each coin she added, her dream of returning to school felt a little closer. The daily conversations with David at the market had become the brightest part of her day. He would tell her about his work, and she would tell him about the books she wished she could read. Their friendship was a small, warm fire in the coldness of her life. One evening, Grace came running into their room, her face flushed with excitement. She had just returned from school. "Hope, I have wonderful news," she exclaimed, waving a piece of paper in her hand. "What is it?" Hope asked, looking up from the mending she was doing on her old uniform. "The school announced a scholarship competition. It's for the best student in our class. There's an essay to write and an exam. If you win, they will pay for your school fees all the way through secondary school." Hope's heart leaped. A full scholarship. It was more than she had ever dared to dream. "Really, Grace?" "Yes, I got the form for you," Grace said, pressing the paper into Hope's hand. "You have to apply. You are the smartest person in our class. I know you can win it." Hope stared at the form. It was a simple piece of paper, but it held the weight of all her hopes. For a moment she allowed herself to imagine it, winning the scholarship, going to school every day without fear, and one day becoming a teacher, just as she had always dreamed. "What is all this noise about?" Auntie Rose's sharp voice cut through the air as she entered the room. Joy trailed behind her, a curious look on her face. Auntie Rose snatched the form from Hope's hand. "A scholarship," she sneered, her eyes scanning the paper. "And what makes you think you are deserving of a scholarship? Your place is on the farm, not in a classroom filling your head with useless knowledge." Joy smirked. "She thinks she is better than everyone else. Let her go and write an essay about how to weed cassava." The cruel words were like stones, and Hope felt her fragile hope begin to crumble. "But Mama," Grace began, "if she wins, it will not cost you any money." "I don't care," Auntie Rose snapped, tearing the form in half and throwing the pieces on the floor. "I have said she is not going to school, and that is final. Now get back to your chores, both of you." She stormed out of the room, Joy following her like a shadow. Hope knelt and slowly picked up the torn pieces of the form. She held them in her hand, her vision blurring with tears. It felt as if her aunt had not just torn a piece of paper, but her very soul. Later that night, as the house slept, Grace crept over to Hope's mat. She was crying softly. "Hope, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "It's not your fault, Grace," Hope said, her own voice thick with unshed tears. "No, it's worse than you think," Grace said, her voice trembling. "I heard Mama and Papa talking tonight. I was outside their window." She took a shaky breath. "Papa, he said he hates you." Hope felt a cold dread creep into her heart. "Why? What did I do?" "It's not you," Grace sobbed quietly. "It's about your father. Papa said that your father, his own brother, cheated him out of their family land many years ago. He said your father became wealthy from that land while he remained poor. He said he would never forgive him, and he said he would make sure that his brother's children suffered just as he suffered." Hope listened in stunned silence. All these years, she had thought their cruelty was just because they saw her as a burden, but it was deeper than that. It was a cold, calculated revenge against a dead man, and she and her brother were the pawns in his bitter game. "Mama agreed with him," Grace continued, her words choked with fear. "She said they would never let you succeed. That's why they won't let you go to school. They want you to be a farmer, to be poor, just like they were." The full weight of Grace's words settled on Hope like a physical blow. It wasn't just a lack of love. It was a deep-seated hatred that had been festering for years. Her uncle was not just a guardian. He was her enemy. The house was not just a prison. It was a battlefield, where she was fighting a war she didn't even know existed. She lay on her mat for a long time after Grace had gone back to her own bed, the torn pieces of the scholarship form clutched in her hand. The knowledge of her uncle's betrayal was a heavy stone in her chest. Now she understood. They would never change. They would never show her kindness. If she wanted a future, she couldn't just hope for it. She would have to fight for it with every bit of strength she had. Her little groundnut business was no longer just a way to pay for school. It was her only weapon in a silent, desperate war for her own life. The news of the land dispute settled heavily on Hope's spirit, but it did not break it. Instead, it hardened her resolve. She worked on the farm with a quiet fury and sold her groundnuts with a new sense of urgency. The small clay pot under the floorboard became her secret bank, her symbol of defiance against her uncle's bitter legacy. Her friendship with David deepened. He was the only person she could talk to, the only one who saw her as more than her family's servant. One sweltering afternoon, a sleek black car, unlike any the village had ever seen, pulled up in front of Uncle Ben's house. The dust it kicked up settled on the goats and chickens, who scattered in alarm. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, followed by an elegantly dressed woman. Auntie Rose and Uncle Ben rushed out of the house, their faces a mixture of confusion and awe. "Good afternoon," the man said, his voice smooth and educated. "We are here on behalf of Prince Edward of the neighboring kingdom. He is seeking the hand of a young lady from this house in marriage." Auntie Rose's eyes widened. A prince? She and Uncle Ben exchanged a quick, greedy glance. This was the opportunity of a lifetime. "A young lady?" Auntie Rose asked, her voice suddenly sweet as honey. "Which of our daughters does the prince seek?" The woman smiled. The prince saw her at the market, a lovely girl selling groundnuts. He was very taken with her grace and humility. Hope was at the back of the house washing clothes when she heard the commotion. She peeked around the corner just in time to see the visitors. A cold feeling washed over her. She was the only girl from this house who sold groundnuts at the market. Before she could process what was happening, Auntie Rose came rushing to the back, her face a mask of false concern. "Hope, my dear, you look so tired. Go to your room and rest. I will finish the washing." Hope was stunned. Her aunt had never offered to do her chores before. Confused, she did as she was told, retreating to the small, windowless room she shared with her sisters. From inside, she could hear her aunt's muffled voice. "Joy? Joy, come here at once," Auntie Rose called. "Put on your best dress, the one you borrowed from your cousin, and wash that dirt off your face. Your future has arrived." Hope's heart sank as she understood. They were going to pass off Joy as the girl the prince had seen. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It wasn't enough to deny her an education. They were now trying to steal her future, her chance at a different life. Through a crack in the wooden door, Hope watched as Joy emerged, wearing a brightly colored dress that was too tight for her. Her face was scrubbed clean, and she was trying to walk with a grace she did not possess. Auntie Rose fussed over her, pushing her towards the front porch where the visitors waited. "This is our daughter," Auntie Rose announced proudly, presenting Joy with a flourish. "The one who helps us at the market. A very hard-working and obedient girl." Joy gave a clumsy curtsy, nearly tripping over her own feet. She smiled a wide, unnatural smile at the visitors. "I am honored to meet you," she said, her voice sounding high and strange. The prince's family looked confused. The elegant woman leaned over to her husband and whispered something. The man cleared his throat. "Are you certain this is the girl who sells groundnuts?" he asked, looking from Joy's brightly colored dress to her soft, uncalloused hands. The girl the prince described was simpler in her dress, and she had a quiet dignity about her. Uncle Ben stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "Of course, this is she, our Joy. Sometimes she dresses simply for the market, you know, not to attract unwanted attention. She is a very modest girl." Hope leaned against the door, her body trembling with a mixture of anger and humiliation. They were selling a lie, and she was the price they were willing to pay. She felt trapped, invisible, as if her own life was being traded away right in front of her, and she was powerless to stop it. The grand car outside and the talk of a prince felt like a scene from a dream, but for Hope, it was quickly turning into another nightmare. Grace stood in the doorway of the main room, her heart pounding in her chest. She had watched the entire charade unfold, her stomach twisting into a tight knot of shame and anger. She saw the confusion on the faces of the royal visitors and the desperate, greedy hope in her parents' eyes. She saw Joy, preening and posing, so eager to claim a life that wasn't hers. And she thought of Hope, hidden away in the back room, her spirit being crushed once again. Something inside Grace snapped. For years she had been quiet, obedient, and afraid. She had watched her parents' cruelty and said nothing, too scared of their anger. But this was different. This was not just about chores or a missed quiz. This was about a life, about a future being stolen. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she stepped into the room. "Mama, Papa," she said, her voice small but clear. "This is not right." All eyes turned to her. Auntie Rose's face darkened with fury. "What did you say? Go back to your room!" No, Grace said, her courage growing with each word. She turned to the visitors. Please, sirs, madam, there has been a mistake. This is my sister, Joy. But she is not the girl your prince saw at the market. The room fell into a shocked silence. Joy's face turned pale and her fake smile faltered. Uncle Ben took a threatening step towards Grace, his face a thundercloud. Grace, you foolish girl! What nonsense are you spouting? He growled. But Grace did not back down. She looked directly at the elegant woman. The girl who sells groundnuts is my other sister, Hope. My parents have hidden her in the back room. They are trying to deceive you. The elegant woman's eyes narrowed. She looked from Grace's earnest face to Joy's guilty one, and then to the furious faces of Auntie Rose and Uncle Ben. The truth settled into the room, cold and undeniable. Is this true? The man asked, his voice low and dangerous. Uncle Ben stammered, No, she is just a child. She doesn't know what she is saying. But it was too late. The woman stood up, her regal posture radiating disappointment and disgust. I see. We were warned about the treachery in some families, but I did not expect to see it so plainly. We will not be a part of this deception. She turned to her husband. Let us go. The prince will be very disappointed, but it is better he knows the truth now. Without another word, the royal visitors walked out of the house, leaving behind a thick, heavy silence. The moment the sound of their car engine faded, Uncle Ben turned on Grace. His hand flew out, and the sharp crack of a slap echoed through the house. You have ruined us, he roared, his face contorted with rage. You have shamed this family. Grace stumbled back, her hand flying to her cheek, tears streaming down her face. Hope could not stay hidden any longer. She burst out of her room and ran to her sister's side. Don't touch her, Hope cried, standing between Grace and their uncle. Uncle Ben's fury now turned to her. You! This is all your fault! You and your cursed luck! He raised his hand to strike her, but his eyes were so full of hatred that Hope did not flinch. She just stared back, her heart filled with a strange, cold calm. Get out of my house! He bellowed, his voice shaking with rage. I have had enough of you. Pack your things and leave. I don't want to see your face in this house again. Auntie Rose nodded in agreement, her eyes gleaming with malice. Yes, go. Go and find your own way in the world since you think you are so clever. See how far your scholarship forms and groundnuts will take you. The threat was real this time. The finality in his voice was chilling. Hope held her sister's hand, her mind racing. She had been pushed to the edge, and now, it seemed, she was about to be pushed over. The unraveling of the lie had led to the unraveling of her life in this house. She had nowhere to go, but she knew she could not stay. The house was suffocatingly quiet after the storm of her uncle's anger. Grace was in their room, her sobs muffled by her pillow. Joy was sulking on the porch, her dreams of becoming a princess shattered. Auntie Rose and Uncle Ben sat in the main room, speaking in low, angry whispers. Hope moved through the house like a ghost, her heart a heavy, cold stone in her chest. Get out of my house. The words echoed in her mind. It was a threat she had heard before, but this time it felt different. This time it felt final. She had to leave, but where would she go? A small flicker of hope ignited within her. Her money, the money from her groundnut business. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get a bus ticket to a nearby town. Maybe rent a small room for a week while she figured out what to do. It was her only lifeline. She waited until she was sure no one was watching. Then, with her heart pounding, she slipped into her room. The floorboard where she had hidden her clay pot was loose, just as she had left it. Her hands trembled as she lifted the board. The space beneath was empty. For a moment she just stared, her mind refusing to understand. The clay pot was gone. Her savings, every 50 naira note she had earned, every coin she had carefully counted and hidden away, it was all gone. A wave of nausea washed over her. She frantically dug her fingers into the dirt, hoping the pot had just been pushed aside. But there was nothing. Only cold, hard earth. She knew with a sickening certainty who had taken it. Auntie Rose. Hope stood up, a cold, hard anger replacing the fear and despair. This was more than just cruelty. This was theft. Her aunt had not only stolen her money, she had stolen her last chance at escape, her last shred of hope. She walked out of the room and straight into the living room, where her aunt and uncle were sitting. She stood before them, her small body trembling not with fear, but with a rage so deep it burned away her tears. "Where is my money?" she asked, her voice low and shaking. Auntie Rose looked up, a look of feigned innocence on her face. "What money are you talking about?" "The money in my clay pot. The money I earned from selling groundnuts. You took it." It was not a question. It was a statement. Her aunt let out a cruel laugh. "Your money! You live under my roof. You eat my food, and you have the audacity to talk about your money. Any money you make belongs to this family. It belongs to me." "You are a thief," Hope whispered, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. Uncle Ben shot to his feet. "How dare you speak to your aunt like that? You ungrateful little rat." He raised his hand as if to strike her again. But this time, Hope did not cower. She stood her ground, her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. "You can beat me," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "You can throw me out, but you cannot break me. You have taken everything from me, my parents, my education, my money, but you will not take my spirit." She looked from her uncle's shocked face to her aunt's smug one. She saw the years of hatred, the deep-seated jealousy, the bottomless greed, and she knew, in that moment, that there was nothing left for her here. There was no love, no safety, no future. "I am leaving," she said, her voice clear and steady now. "You don't have to throw me out. I am walking away." She turned her back on them, on the only home she had known for 5 long years. She walked back to her room, but not to pack. There was nothing to pack. Her aunt had already taken everything. She walked past the picture of her parents, her heart aching with a silent goodbye. Then she walked out the back door and into the encroaching darkness of the night. She didn't know where she was going. She had no money, no plan, no one to turn to. All she had was the burning anger in her heart and the desperate, terrifying freedom of having absolutely nothing left to lose. The final straw had broken, and now she was adrift in a storm of her own making. The night was as dark as a sealed tomb. There was no moon, no stars, only a thick blanket of clouds that hung heavy and low over the village. Hope walked without direction, her bare feet stumbling over the uneven, dusty path. The familiar sounds of the village night, the chirping of crickets, the distant barking of a dog, seemed alien and threatening. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden danger. Her uncle's angry words and her aunt's mocking laughter echoed in her head. She had been so sure, so defiant when she walked out of the house. But now, alone in the darkness, a cold, sharp fear began to creep in. Where was she going? What would she do? She had no money, not even a single coin. She was truly, utterly alone. A tear escaped her eye, then another, until silent tears were streaming down her face, mixing with the dust on her cheeks. She was not just crying for her stolen money or her lost home. She was crying for her lost childhood, for the parents she missed so dearly, for the heavy, unfair burden that had been placed on her small shoulders. As if the sky itself was weeping with her, a low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. A cool wind whipped through the trees, carrying the earthy smell of rain. Within minutes, the first heavy drops began to fall, splattering against the dry ground like dark coins. The drizzle quickly turned into a torrential downpour. The rain came down in sheets, drenching her thin dress in seconds and plastering it to her skin. The path turned to slippery red mud, and she struggled to keep her footing. She was cold, she was wet, and she was terrified. She saw the dark skeleton of an unfinished building by the side of the road, a half-built house with no roof and empty window frames. It was a desolate, lonely place, but it offered the only shelter from the relentless storm. She scrambled up the low, uncompleted wall and huddled under the small overhang of what would have been a veranda. The rain hammered down on the concrete floor around her, a loud, chaotic drumming that matched the turmoil in her heart. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering uncontrollably, as much from cold as from despair. This was it. This was the end of her road. She had fought so hard, saved every naira, dreamed so fiercely of a different life. And now here she was, a homeless orphan, sheltering in a ruin, with a future as dark and stormy as the night around her. She buried her face in her knees, her body racked with sobs. She cried until she had no tears left, until all that was left was a hollow, empty ache. The world had taken everything from her. There was nothing left to fight for. Suddenly, through the roar of the rain, she heard a voice calling her name. It was faint at first, almost lost in the storm. Hope! Hope! Are you there? She lifted her head, her heart skipping a beat. The voice was familiar. She peered out into the darkness, and through the curtain of rain she saw a figure approaching, holding a large banana leaf over his head like a makeshift umbrella. "David," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He saw her then and rushed towards the unfinished building. He jumped over the low wall and knelt beside her. It was David, his kind face etched with worry. "Hope, I was so worried," he said, his voice full of concern. "I didn't see you at the market this evening. I came to your house, but your uncle said you had left." "What happened? Why are you out here in the storm?" Seeing his kind, familiar face was like seeing the sun after a long, dark night. The dam of her composure broke, and she began to cry again, not with despair this time, but with the overwhelming relief of no longer being alone. He didn't press her for answers. He simply sat beside her in the damp darkness, a quiet, steady presence against the chaos of the storm. He took off his own dry shirt, which he had kept sheltered under the leaf, and draped it over her shivering shoulders. The simple act of kindness was so overwhelming that Hope could only weep. When her sobs finally subsided, she told him everything. About the prince's visit, the deception, her uncle's rage, and the stolen money. She told him about her desperate flight into the night, her voice barely a whisper against the sound of the rain. David listened in silence, his expression growing darker and angrier with every word she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The storm outside was beginning to calm, the rain softening to a gentle patter. "They will not get away with this," he said finally, his voice low and firm. "But you cannot stay here. You are not safe." He stood up and held out his hand to her. "Come with me. I have a place. You will be safe there." Hope looked at his outstretched hand. In the darkness, she could see the calluses on his palm, the marks of his own hard labor. He was just a poor block carrier, with little to his name. But in that moment, he was offering her something more valuable than all the money in the world: safety, kindness, and a place to belong. Without hesitation, she took his hand. His grip was warm and strong, a solid anchor in the stormy sea of her life. David led Hope through the wet, silent streets of the village. The rain had stopped, and the air was fresh and clean. The moon peeked out from behind the clouds, casting a silvery light on the glistening leaves and muddy puddles. They walked without speaking, his hand holding hers, a quiet promise of safety. He led her to a part of the village she had never been to before, a small cluster of newly built houses at the edge of the community. He stopped in front of a modest one-room apartment with a simple wooden door. "This is it," he said softly, fumbling in his pocket for a key. "I just rented it last week. I was saving up to move out of my friend's place. It's not much, but it's clean and dry." He opened the door and gestured for her to enter. The room was small and bare, with a single window and a concrete floor. In one corner was a rolled-up sleeping mat and a small bag with his belongings. It was the humblest of homes, but to Hope, after the storm and the darkness, it looked like a palace. "You can have the room," David said, not meeting her eyes. "I will go and sleep at my friend's place for the night. You will be safe here. No one will bother you." Hope stood in the middle of the small room, overwhelmed by his kindness. He, a man who had so little, was giving her his only shelter without a second thought. "David, I don't know what to say," she stammered, clutching his dry shirt around her shoulders. "Thank you." "There is no need for thanks," he said with a small, shy smile. "Friends help each other." He hesitated for a moment. "Are you hungry? I have some bread and ground nuts." He brought out a small loaf of bread and a packet of ground nuts from his bag and gave them to her. Hope ate hungrily, realizing she hadn't had anything since her small portion of dinner hours ago. As she ate, David lit a small kerosene lamp, and its warm, flickering light filled the room, chasing away the last of the night's shadows. For the first time in 5 years, Hope felt truly safe. There were no angry voices, no mocking laughter, no threats. There was only the quiet kindness of this young man, who had appeared like a guardian angel in the middle of her storm. She looked at him in the soft lamplight. His simple clothes, his work-worn hands, his gentle eyes, and felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the dry shirt or the food. It was a feeling she hadn't known since her parents were alive. It was the feeling of being cared for. "You should get some rest," David said, seeing the exhaustion on her face. He unrolled the mat for her. I will come back in the morning to check on you. He turned to leave, but Hope's voice stopped him at the door. David? He turned back, his silhouette framed by the moonlit doorway. Why are you being so kind to me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He was silent for a long moment, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Because, he said softly, I have been watching you for a long time, Hope. I have seen your strength, your goodness, and your beautiful heart. And I believe you deserve a life filled with kindness, not cruelty. With those words, he was gone, leaving Hope alone in the small, quiet room. She lay down on the mat, pulling his shirt tighter around her. The fabric smelled faintly of sawdust and honest work. She thought about his words, about the way he had looked at her. It was more than just friendship she saw in his eyes. It was something deeper, something she was almost too afraid to name. As she drifted off to sleep, she realized that this small, bare room was more of a home to her than her uncle's house had ever been. Here, she was not a servant or a burden. Here, she was simply Hope, and for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. The storm had passed, and in its wake she had found an unexpected shelter, a new beginning offered by a kind-hearted stranger who held a secret she could not yet imagine. Hope woke to the sound of a rooster crowing and the soft light of dawn filtering through the single window. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure of where she was. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back. The fight, the escape, the storm, and David's incredible kindness. She was in his room, safe and sound. She sat up and looked around. The room was even simpler in the daylight. But it was tidy. His few possessions were neatly arranged in a corner. She folded the shirt he had given her, the scent of him still clinging to the fabric. She felt a strange mix of gratitude and anxiety. She was safe for now, but what would happen next? She was still a homeless girl with no money and no future. Just then, there was a soft knock on the door. It was David, holding a small bowl of steaming pap and a piece of bean cake. Good morning, he said with his usual warm smile. I brought you breakfast. You shouldn't have, Hope said, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. You have already done too much for me. Nonsense, he said, placing the bowl on the floor. Eat. You need your strength. As she ate the simple but delicious meal, David sat on the floor opposite her, his expression serious. The usual easygoing smile was gone, replaced by a look of deep contemplation. Hope, he began, his voice low and steady. I have something to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago. Hope put down her bowl, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. She sensed that this was important. What I am about to say will be hard to believe, he continued, looking directly into her eyes. But I ask you to listen with an open heart. Everything you know about me is not the whole truth. He took a deep breath. My name is not just David. My full name is Prince David. I am the son of the king of Amobia, the neighboring kingdom. Hope stared at him, her mind struggling to make sense of his words. Prince David? The kind, humble block carrier was a prince? It sounded like something out of a fairy tale. She thought it must be a joke, a strange way to try and cheer her up. You are joking, she said with a nervous laugh. I am not, he replied, his gaze unwavering. My father, the king, sent me here in disguise. He believes that a man's true character is revealed when he has nothing. He wanted me to live and work among the common people, to understand their struggles, and to find a wife who would love me for who I am, not for my title or my wealth. He reached into the small bag he had brought with him and pulled out a small leather-bound wallet. From it, he took out a laminated card with a royal crest and his picture. It was an official palace identification card. Then he showed her a photograph. It was of him, dressed in magnificent royal robes, standing beside an older, dignified man and a graceful woman who wore crowns. Hope looked from the photograph to the man sitting before her. It was the same person, yet it was not. The man in the picture was a prince, a figure of power and authority. The man before her was David, her kind and gentle friend. Her mind reeled. I have been watching you for months, Hope, he went on, his voice soft and earnest. I saw you at the market, working so hard, always with a kind word for everyone, even when I knew your own life was difficult. I saw your strength and your resilience. I saw the beauty of your heart. You are the woman my father sent me to find. You are the woman I have fallen in love with." He moved closer to her, his eyes filled with a sincerity that took her breath away. "I know this is sudden. I know your life is in turmoil right now. But I am asking you, Hope. Will you be my wife? Will you be my princess?" Hope was speechless. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. A prince. In love with her. It was too much to comprehend. Just yesterday, she was a despised orphan, sleeping on a cold floor. Now a prince was asking her to be his wife, offering her a life she could never have imagined in her wildest dreams. Tears welled up in her eyes. But this time, they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of shock, of disbelief, of a hope so overwhelming it felt like it could burst her heart. She looked at David, Prince David, and saw not a royal title or a distant king, but the same kind eyes, the same gentle smile that had been her only comfort for so long. She didn't know what to say. The only thing she could do was nod, a small, trembling movement. A slow, brilliant smile spread across David's face. He reached out and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. In that moment, the humble one-room apartment became a palace, and the simple groundnut seller began to believe that fairy tales might, just might, be real after all. The days that followed were a blur for Hope. Prince David treated her with a gentle respect that she had never known. He insisted she rest while he made arrangements. He brought her new clothes, simple but beautiful, and made sure she had plenty to eat. They spent hours talking, and Hope found herself opening up to him in a way she never had with anyone else. She told him about her dreams of becoming a teacher, and he listened with genuine interest, promising that as his wife, she could achieve anything she set her mind to. A week after his revelation, David told her it was time. "My family is coming," he said, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "They are coming to formally ask for your hand in marriage." "Here?" Hope asked, looking around the small room. David laughed. "No, my love. They will go to your uncle's house. It is the proper way. We must follow tradition." Hope felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. "But David, you heard what my uncle said. He hates me. He will never agree." "Leave your uncle to me," David said, his voice firm. "It is time for him to face the consequences of his actions." On the appointed day, the village was thrown into a state of unprecedented excitement. A convoy of 5 gleaming black SUVs, the kind usually seen only in movies, rolled slowly down the main village road, their polished surfaces reflecting the morning sun. Villagers poured out of their houses, pointing and whispering in amazement. Who were these important visitors? Where were they going? The convoy did not stop at the chief's compound as expected. Instead, it continued down the dusty path and came to a stop directly in front of Uncle Ben's small, modest house. Uncle Ben, Auntie Rose, and Joy were sitting on the porch, still nursing their anger and disappointment from the previous week. When they saw the magnificent cars, their jaws dropped. "It must be Prince Edward's family," Auntie Rose hissed, jumping to her feet. "They have come back. Joy, go and put on your good dress, quickly." Uncle Ben puffed out his chest, a greedy smile spreading across his face. He smoothed down his worn shirt, preparing to welcome his royal in-laws. But the person who stepped out of the lead car was not Prince Edward, it was David. He was no longer the humble block carrier in dusty clothes. He was dressed in a flowing embroidered agbada of the richest blue, with a royal beaded cap on his head. He moved with an air of quiet authority and confidence that was breathtaking. Behind him, an older, regal-looking man and a beautifully dressed woman emerged, the king and queen of Amobia. They were followed by a procession of chiefs and elders, all dressed in equally impressive attire. Uncle Ben, Auntie Rose, and Joy stared in stunned silence. Their minds could not reconcile the image before them with the poor laborer they had dismissed so easily. David, the boy who bought groundnuts at the market, was a prince. It was impossible. The villagers who had followed the convoy gathered at a respectful distance, their whispers turning into a loud buzz of shock and excitement. David walked calmly up the steps to the porch, his eyes meeting his uncle's. There was no anger in his gaze, only a cool, unwavering authority. "Good morning, Uncle Ben," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I have brought my family. We have come on a very important matter." Uncle Ben could only stammer, "You..." You, who are you? Before David could reply, his father, the king, stepped forward. His presence was commanding, and the entire compound fell silent. I am King Adekunle of Amobia, he announced, his voice booming with royal power, and this is my son, Prince David. We have come here today to seek the hand of your niece Hope in marriage for my son. The words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow to the shocked and terrified family on the porch. The world had been turned completely upside down. The girl they had thrown out like rubbish was about to become a princess. The poor boy they had looked down on was a prince who now held their fate in his hands. Auntie Rose's face had turned a sickly shade of grey, and Joy looked as if she was about to faint. Uncle Ben stood frozen, his mouth open, for the first time in his life, utterly speechless. The royal procession had arrived, and with it a reckoning that was long overdue. The scene on the porch was one of frozen disbelief. Uncle Ben, who was usually so full of bluster and authority, looked like a fish out of water, his mouth opening and closing without a sound. Auntie Rose seemed to have shrunk into herself, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and envy. Joy, the girl who had dreamed of being a princess, stood beside her mother, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated jealousy. The king, a man used to commanding respect, looked at the stunned family with a cool, appraising gaze. He had heard the whole story from his son, and he was not impressed. Well, the king prompted, his voice calm but firm. We have stated our purpose. We have come to ask for the hand of the young lady known as Hope. Uncle Ben finally found his voice, though it was a weak, trembling whisper. Hope? But your majesty, there must be a mistake. She is not worthy. She has a curse on her. The king's eyebrows rose slightly. A curse? And what curse would that be? Her father decreed that she should not marry, Uncle Ben stammered, clutching at the old lie like a drowning man. She must stay in this house to bear children for our family name. A slow, dangerous smile touched the king's lips. Is that so? Or is it that you have been holding this girl captive, denying her an education and a future, all because of some old, bitter grievance you held against her dead father? A dispute over land, I believe. The color drained from Uncle Ben's face. He had been exposed. The king knew everything. The villagers who were gathered around the compound began to murmur amongst themselves, their shocked whispers spreading like wildfire. We did not come here to discuss old family quarrels or fabricated curses, the king continued, his voice ringing with authority. We came here to follow tradition, and tradition dictates that we ask you, as her guardian, for her hand. But make no mistake, the final choice belongs to her. At that moment, another car from the convoy, a sleek silver one, pulled up. A palace maid opened the door and Hope stepped out. The transformation was astounding. She was no longer the girl in the faded dress with dusty feet. She was wearing a beautiful gown of soft, flowing fabric that shimmered in the sunlight. Her hair was styled in an elegant cascade of braids, and delicate jewelry adorned her neck and wrists. She looked radiant, beautiful, and every bit the princess she was about to become. But as she walked towards the porch, her eyes were not filled with triumph, but with a quiet, sad wisdom. She walked past the stunned villagers, past her shocked and terrified relatives, and stood beside Prince David. He took her hand and smiled at her, a look of pure love and admiration in his eyes. The king turned to her. My dear, he said, his voice softening, my son has told us everything about you. He has chosen you, and we, his family, welcome you with open hearts. We have come to ask for your hand in marriage. What is your answer? This was the moment. The culmination of all her suffering, all her hope. The entire village was watching. Her cruel relatives stood before her, their fates now resting on her word. She looked at David, who squeezed her hand reassuringly. She looked at Grace, who was standing at the edge of the crowd, tears of joy streaming down her face. And then she looked at Uncle Ben, Auntie Rose, and Joy, who were now staring at her with undisguised fear. Power. For the first time in her life, she had power. The power to say yes and step into a new life, and the power to exact revenge for all the years of pain. The shock of a lifetime was not just for her family, it was for her too. The girl who sold groundnuts was being offered a crown, and the weight of that choice, the weight of her past and her future, settled upon her. The silence in the compound was so thick you could feel it. Every eye was on Hope. Her uncle, who had once held absolute power over her life,
now stood before her, a broken, trembling man. Auntie Rose, whose words had been a constant source of pain, was pale and silent. Joy, who had mocked her relentlessly, looked on with a mixture of hatred and despair. Hope felt the weight of their gaze, the weight of all the years of mistreatment. A part of her, a small, wounded part, wanted to see them suffer. She wanted to turn her back on them, to walk away into her new life and leave them to face the shame and ruin they so richly deserved. She could say no, that they were not her family, that they had forfeited that right long ago. But then she looked at Prince David. His eyes were not filled with a desire for revenge, but with a quiet, steady love. He was not asking her to punish them. He was simply asking her to be his wife. And she looked at Grace, her one true ally in that house, whose face was shining with pure, unselfish happiness for her. And in that moment, Hope understood something profound. True strength was not in revenge, but in rising above the pain. True royalty was not about power over others, but about grace and compassion. The crown she was being offered was not a weapon to be used against her enemies. It was a chance to build a new life, a better life.
She turned to the king, her voice clear and strong. "Your Majesty, I am honored. I accept your son's proposal." A cheer went up from the crowd of villagers. The king smiled, a broad, genuine smile of approval. Prince David beamed, his hand tightening on hers. The formal proceedings began. The elders from Amobia presented the traditional gifts: yams, palm wine, and wrappers. As tradition demanded, Uncle Ben, as her guardian, had to accept them. He did so with shaking hands and downcast eyes, a humbled man stripped of all his false pride. When it was time for Hope to give the palm wine to her chosen husband, she took the cup and walked first to her uncle. She knelt before him, as custom required. "Papa," she said, using the respectful term, "this is the man I have chosen." Uncle Ben could not meet her eyes. He simply nodded, his face a mask of shame. She then went to Auntie Rose, who flinched as she approached. Hope knelt again. "Mama, I bring you your son-in-law." The formal words, spoken with such quiet dignity, were a greater punishment than any angry outburst could have been. They highlighted the respect Hope was showing them, a respect they had never shown her. Finally, she walked to Prince David, who was waiting for her with a look of immense pride and love. She knelt before him and presented the cup. "My husband," she said softly, "drink." He took the cup, drank from it, and then passed it back to her. She drank as well, sealing their union. As he helped her to her feet, the crowd erupted in celebration. David, now officially her husband, gently led her to a seat of honor beside his parents. As she sat down, she felt the true weight of the crown she had just accepted. It was not the weight of gold or jewels, but the weight of a new responsibility. She had moved from a world of powerlessness to a world of influence. She was no longer just Hope, the orphan. She was Princess Hope, the future queen. The shock of a lifetime was fading, replaced by a deep and quiet understanding of the new path that lay before her. A path that would require not just strength, but a grace and wisdom she was only just beginning to discover. The celebration was in full swing. The air was filled with the sound of music, laughter, and the joyful chatter of the villagers. The royal family had brought an abundance of food and drink, and everyone was feasting. It was a day the village would talk about for generations. In the midst of the joyous chaos, Hope sat quietly beside her new mother-in-law, the Queen. She watched the celebration, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She saw her uncle, aunt, and Joy huddled together at the far end of the compound, isolated in their own shame. No one was speaking to them. They were outcasts at their own family's celebration. Despite everything they had done to her, a small pang of pity stirred in her heart. They were still her family, the only relatives she had left in the world. Sensing her troubled thoughts, the Queen placed a gentle hand on her arm. "They hurt you deeply, my child," she said, her voice kind. "It is understandable if your heart is heavy." "I don't know what to feel," Hope confessed. "A part of me is angry, but another part feels sad for them." "That is the mark of a true queen, my dear," the Queen said with a knowing smile. "A heart that can feel compassion, even for those who have wronged it. But the choice of what to do with that feeling is yours alone." Later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the compound. Uncle Ben, Auntie Rose, and Joy approached the royal seats. They moved slowly, hesitantly, their faces etched with fear and regret. They stopped a few feet away and, to the shock of everyone watching, knelt on the ground. "Princess Hope," Uncle Ben began, his voice raspy and broken. He could not bring himself to call her by her simple name anymore. We have come to beg for your forgiveness." Auntie Rose was weeping openly, her usual harshness completely gone. "We were wicked to you, my child. We were blinded by greed and old bitterness. Please find it in your heart to forgive us. We are shamed before the entire village. We have nothing left." Joy, her face streaked with tears, simply sobbed, unable to speak. Hope looked down at the three people who had caused her so much pain. She saw them not as the powerful tyrants of her childhood, but as they truly were, small, broken people, consumed by their own bitterness. She remembered the nights she had cried herself to sleep, the days of hunger, the constant insults. The anger was still there, a hot coal in her chest. But then she remembered David's kindness. She remembered the Queen's wise words, and she remembered her own parents, who had taught her that love was always stronger than hate. Holding on to her anger would only chain her to the past. It would poison her new life. She took a deep breath and stood up. She walked over to them and gently touched her uncle's shoulder. "Please, stand up," she said, her voice soft but firm. They looked up at her, their eyes wide with surprise. "What you did to me was wrong," she said, her voice steady. "It caused me more pain than you can ever know. But I will not carry that pain with me into my new life." She looked at each of them in turn. "I forgive you." The words were simple, but they held an immense power. A wave of relief washed over their faces. Auntie Rose sobbed with gratitude, and Uncle Ben simply bowed his head, unable to speak. Hope then turned to Grace, who was standing nearby, watching with tears in her eyes. She pulled her sister into a tight hug. "Thank you, Grace," she whispered. "You were my only light in the darkness. I will never forget it." In that moment, Hope felt a profound sense of release. It was as if a heavy chain she had been carrying for years had finally been broken. Forgiveness was not a gift she was giving to them. It was a gift she was giving to herself. It was the final step in leaving her old life behind and stepping fully into her new one. The grace of forgiveness was the most precious jewel in her new crown, and it shone more brightly than any gold or diamond. She was free. The palace in Lagos was a world away from the small, dusty village Hope had grown up in. It was a magnificent white mansion surrounded by lush, manicured gardens. The rooms were vast, with high ceilings, polished marble floors, and furniture so beautiful it looked like it belonged in a museum. For the first few weeks, Hope walked through the palace as if in a dream, half expecting to wake up on her old mat with Auntie Rose's voice shouting at her to start her chores. But this was no dream. This was her new reality. She was Princess Hope, wife of Prince David, and the daughter-in-law of the king and queen. They treated her with a love and respect that healed the old wounds in her heart. The king, a wise and just ruler, saw in her a quiet strength and intelligence. The queen took her under her wing, teaching her the ways of the court, not as a set of rules, but as a way to serve their people with grace and compassion. Prince David was her constant companion. He had kept his promise. Their love was not about titles or wealth. It was built on the foundation of the friendship they had formed when he was a humble block carrier and she was a determined groundnut seller. He cherished her, listened to her ideas, and encouraged her dreams. One of her first requests as a princess was to ensure Grace's education. With the king's blessing, she set up a fund that would not only pay for Grace's secondary school fees, but would also see her through university. When Hope traveled back to the village to give Grace the news, her stepsister wept with joy. For Grace, it was not just about the money. It was about the fulfillment of a shared dream, a promise kept between two sisters who had found light in each other's darkness. But Hope knew her work was not done. She could not forget the girl she used to be, the girl who had to fight for every page of a textbook, for every chance to learn. She remembered the countless other girls in her village and in villages across Nigeria whose dreams were being extinguished by poverty and tradition. With David's full support, she established the Hope Foundation for Girls' Education. She used her own resources and her new position to build schools in rural areas, provide scholarships, and create programs that would empower young women to pursue their dreams. She traveled across the country, sharing her own story, not as a fairy tale of a poor girl who married a prince, but as a testament to the power of resilience and the importance of education. She became a beacon of hope for thousands of girls who saw in her a reflection of their own potential. She never cut ties with her old family. True to her word, she had forgiven them. She sent them money regularly and made sure they were comfortable, but she kept a respectful distance. Auntie Rose and Uncle Ben were humbled and quiet now, their old bitterness replaced by a quiet awe of the young woman their niece had become. Joy, after a period of intense jealousy, eventually came to her, asking for forgiveness and help. Hope, remembering the importance of second chances, helped her start a small trading business of her own. One afternoon, years later, Hope was walking through the palace gardens with David. They now had 2 children of their own, a boy and a girl who were playing happily by a fountain. Hope was watching them, a serene smile on her face, when a familiar nutty aroma wafted through the air. A palace chef was roasting groundnuts for a snack. The scent transported her back in time, to the small fire behind her uncle's house, to the dusty market junction, to the battered tray that had held all her dreams. She thought of the journey she had taken, from a heartbroken orphan to a beloved princess, from a seller of groundnuts to a planter of futures. David came and stood beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about, my love?" he asked softly. Hope leaned her head against his shoulder, a deep sense of peace settling over her. "I was just remembering," she said, her voice filled with a quiet gratitude. "I was remembering how it all began." She looked at her beautiful children, at the magnificent palace, at the man she loved by her side. Her life was more than she had ever dreamed it could be, but she knew that her true wealth was not in the crown she sometimes wore, or the palace she lived in. It was in the strength she had found in her darkest moments, in the kindness that had been shown to her, and in the forgiveness that had set her free. Her past had been planted in harsh, unforgiving soil, but from it, a future more beautiful than she could have ever imagined had bloomed.